Some songs only make sense when you've lived the world they were written about, when you remember what it felt like to hear your draft number called, to watch cities burn on the evening news, or to be told that the music you loved was dangerous. These songs carry a weight that requires the experience behind them. Here are 13 songs only baby boomers will understand that modern kids would never. Number 13, Blowin' in the Wind by Bob Dylan, 1963. Bob Dylan released Blowin' in the Wind on his second album The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan in May 1963. He had written it in April 1962, reportedly in approximately 10 minutes at a cafe in Greenwich Village, drawing on a traditional gospel melody. The lyric is built entirely on questions that have no conventional answers. Questions about war, freedom, and human indifference. For baby boomers, the song arrived in a specific historical context. The Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred in October 1962, producing 13 days in which nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union was a genuine possibility. The civil rights movement was building toward its most confrontational period. The Birmingham campaign would begin in April 1963, less than a year after Dylan wrote the song. The questions in the lyric were not abstractions. They mapped directly onto news events that were happening as the song was being heard. Peter, Paul, and Mary recorded a cover version in June 1963 and released it as a single, which reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. Their version introduced the song to a broader mainstream audience than Dylan's own version had reached. By August 1963, it was being performed at the March on Washington, one of the largest civil rights demonstrations in American history, to an audience of approximately 250,000 people on the National Mall. A young person hearing Blowin' in the Wind today here's a folk song with gentle questions. A baby boomer who heard it in 1963 heard it against the sound of air raid sirens, the images of fire hoses turned on children in Birmingham, and the possibility that the world they were growing up in might not survive the decade they were living through. The song is the same, the context is not. Number 12, Turn, Turn, Turn. To Everything There Is a Season by The Byrds, 1965. The Byrds released Turn, Turn, Turn in October 1965, and it reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in December, spending 3 weeks at the top. The song's lyric is drawn almost entirely from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, the ancient text about seasons of human experience. Pete Seeger adapted the text into a song in the late 1950s, and the Byrds recorded it with their signature 12-string Rickenbacker guitar sound and layered harmonies. A time to kill, a time to heal. The specific reason this song belongs to the baby boomer experience is what was happening when the Byrds recorded it. The United States had dramatically escalated its military involvement in Vietnam over the course of 1965. The first major combat troops had landed in March, and by December there were approximately 200,000 American military personnel in the country. For young American men, that escalation was not an abstraction. It was the immediate horizon of their lives. A song about seasons of human experience, a time to be born and a time to die, a time for war and a time for peace, arriving at exactly the moment when a generation of young Americans was being asked to determine which time this was, had a resonance that the ancient text could not have anticipated, and that the Byrds version, with its specific 1965 production, embodied perfectly. Roger McGuinn's 12-string guitar gave the ancient text a contemporary sound that communicated to an audience that had never encountered Ecclesiastes in a church pew, but received it completely through a car radio. Number 11. People Got to Be Free by the Rascals, 1968. The Rascals had been one of the most commercially successful American rock groups of the mid-1960s. Good Lovin' had reached number 1 in 1966, and a series of blue-eyed soul singles had made them one of the decade's dominant acts. People Got to Be Free was released in July 1968 and reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, spending 5 weeks at the top. It was the best-selling single of 1968 in the United States. The song was written by Felix Cavaliere and Eddie Brigati following the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968 and Robert F. Kennedy in June 1968. The two assassinations occurring 8 weeks apart produced a specific quality of national trauma that was unlike anything the baby boomer generation had previously experienced. King had been the moral center of the civil rights movement. Kennedy had been the candidate who represented the possibility of ending both the Vietnam War and the racial crisis simultaneously. The Rascals decided that they would only perform on television programs that agreed to include black performers alongside them, a policy that cost them several bookings. But that was consistent with the song's message. The decision was unusual enough to generate controversy in 1968, when segregated performance lineups were still normal in American commercial television. For baby boomers, "People Got to Be Free" is inseparable from the specific grief of that summer. The two assassinations, the Democratic National Convention riots in Chicago in August, and the election of Richard Nixon in November formed a sequence of events that those who lived through it have described as the moment the idealism of the 1960s broke. The song is a statement about human freedom. For anyone who heard it in 1968, it is also a monument to a specific loss. Number 10. Sky Pilot by Eric Burdon and the Animals, 1968. Eric Burdon had led the original Animals, the British band whose recording of The House of the Rising Sun in 1964 had been one of the decade's most impactful singles, through a series of lineup changes, eventually reforming as Eric Burdon and the New Animals, with a West Coast psychedelic sound. Sky Pilot was released in May 1968 and reached number 14 on the Billboard Hot 100. At over 7 minutes in its full album version, it was one of the longest recordings to achieve significant radio airplay that year. The song is about a military chaplain, the Sky Pilot of the title, which was Korean war slang for a military clergyman, who blesses soldiers before they go into battle and then stands on a hill, watching the carnage that follows, unable to reconcile the blessing with the reality. The production includes a full simulation of a battle with sound effects of guns, explosions, and what appears to be the sound of a bagpipe regiment marching into combat. In 1968, approximately 16,500 American military personnel died in Vietnam, the highest single-year death toll of the entire war. The draft was producing approximately 35,000 new inductees per month. For baby boomer men, the chaplain blessing soldiers before they entered a battle that the song then depicts in explicit sonic detail was not a literary conceit. The combination of religious imagery, military reality, and explicit sound design made Sky Pilot one of the more viscerally direct anti-war statements of the era, and one that only fully communicates to a listener who understands what it meant to have a draft notice arrive in the mail. Number 9. In the Ghetto by Elvis Presley, 1969.
He learns how to steal and he learns how to fight in the ghetto.
Elvis Presley recorded In the Ghetto in January 1969 during the Memphis sessions that produced the From Elvis in Memphis album and marked his commercial and artistic reemergence after years of declining commercial relevance. The song was written by Mac Davis and tells the story of a child born into poverty on a Chicago winter morning, whose life follows a specific trajectory toward violence and death, and ends with another child being born into the same circumstances, beginning the cycle again. The song reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and was Presley's highest-charting single in the United States since 1965. It represented a departure for Presley. He had largely avoided political or social content throughout his career, and the decision to record it was part of the broader reorientation of his artistic identity in 1969.
He's down in the street with a gun in his hand in the ghetto.
For baby boomers, the song arrived at a specific moment in the conversation about poverty and race in America. The riots that had followed King's assassination in April 1968 had consumed 125 American cities and had made urban poverty a national crisis that could not be ignored. The report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, the Kerner Commission, had been released in March 1968, finding that the United States was moving toward 2 separate societies, one black and one white. A song about the cyclical nature of poverty, delivered by the most commercially powerful voice in American popular music in 1969, was part of that specific cultural conversation in a way that requires knowing the conversation to fully understand.
He learns how to steal and he learns how to fight in the ghetto.
Number 8. Abraham, Martin and John by Dion, 1968.
See my old friend John. Can you tell?
Dion DiMucci had been a significant figure in American pop music since the late 1950s. Runaround Sue and The Wanderer had been major hits in 1961 and had spent the mid-1960s largely out of the commercial mainstream. Abraham, Martin and John was released in September 1968 and reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. It also reached number 1 on the Adult Contemporary chart. The song was written by Dick Holler and is a quiet tribute to 4 assassinated American figures: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, and Robert F. Kennedy. It was the first song to address all 4 deaths in a single piece, and its release came just 3 months after Robert Kennedy's assassination. For baby boomers who had lived through each of the 4 deaths, Kennedy's in November 1963, King's in April 1968, and Robert Kennedy's in June 1968. The accumulation of loss the song addressed was not historical. It was biographical.
Abraham and Martin and John.
The generational weight of the song is specific. Baby boomers who were adolescents in 1963 when John Kennedy was shot, who were young adults during the King and Robert Kennedy assassinations in 1968, and who heard Dion sing about all 4 men in a single melody were hearing a compressed account of the decade's losses. Each assassination had its own specific memory: where you were, what you were doing, who told you. The song gathered those separate memories into a single piece and asked its audience to hold them together. A young person today can be told about those events. A baby boomer lived through each one.
Abraham and Martin and John.
Number 7. What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, 1971. Marvin Gaye released What's Going On in January 1971 against significant internal resistance from Motown Records president Berry Gordy, who considered the song uncommercial and inappropriate for Gaye's established commercial profile. Gordy initially refused to release it. Gaye insisted, and Gordy eventually agreed. The single reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B chart. The album that followed, also titled What's Going On, is consistently ranked among the greatest albums in the history of American popular music. The song is written from the perspective of a Vietnam veteran returning home and struggling to understand what has happened to his country in his absence. The protests, the violence, the social fracturing. The specific narrative position of someone who had been at war asking what had happened at home was not hypothetical in 1971. The United States had approximately 335,000 military personnel in Vietnam at the beginning of that year. Hundreds of thousands of veterans had already returned to a country that was deeply divided about the war they had fought in.
Tell me what's out, I want to know what's in. Woo!
For baby boomer men who had served, or whose brothers or friends had served, or who were waiting for their own draft numbers, the narrator's question, what is happening here, was the question of their lives. The protests they were seeing were protests against the same war. The people in the streets were their peers. Gaye's arrangement, the layered vocals, the jazz-influenced horns, the sense of voices talking over each other, gave the album a texture of overlapping conversations that matched the specific quality of 1971 American social life. Number 6. War by Edwin Starr, 1970. War was originally recorded by The Temptations for their 1970 album Psychedelic Shack, but Motown, aware of the song's explicitly anti-war content, was reluctant to release it as a single under The Temptations' name for fear of alienating their mainstream audience. They gave the song to Edwin Starr instead, whose career had less commercial infrastructure to protect. Starr's version was released in June 1970 and reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in August, spending 3 weeks there. It sold over 3 million copies. The recording, built on a relentless rhythm track and Starr's raw, physically committed vocal, was designed not for adult contemporary radio, but for the streets, for protests, for any space where the emotion behind it could be felt physically.
What is it good for?
The context was specific. May 1970 had produced the Kent State shootings, the expansion of the war into Cambodia, and a wave of campus protests that had closed or disrupted hundreds of American universities. The specific anger of the song, the repetition, the volume, the refusal to soften its position, was not aesthetic. It was emotional reporting on a specific political moment. For baby boomers who heard War in the summer of 1970, it was not a song about the general concept of war. It was a song about a specific war in a specific year, affecting specific people they knew. Number 5, Ball of Confusion. That's What the World Is Today, by The Temptations, 1970. Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong wrote Ball of Confusion, and The Temptations recorded it in 1970, releasing it in May and reaching number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song is structured as an inventory of American social crisis in 1970, a list of specific contemporary problems, delivered at a tempo, and with a production intensity that matches the chaos of the content. The specific references, the Vietnam War, the population explosion, segregation, street crime, drug use, political assassinations, environmental collapse, were not metaphors in 1970. They were that morning's newspaper. The genius of the production is that Whitfield and the Temptations found a musical form, the groove-based rock soul of psychedelic funk, that communicated the overwhelming simultaneity of crisis rather than addressing any single issue with conventional protest song earnestness. For baby boomers who were adults or near adults in 1970, Ball of Confusion was a precise inventory of what their daily reality felt like. The specific combination of issues, the war, the racial tension, the environmental anxiety, the sense that institutions were failing simultaneously, required living through all of them at once to fully appreciate. A young person today can read about each of those issues individually. A baby boomer in 1970 was managing all of them as a single, continuous experience. And the song's structure, everything at once, unresolved, building, reproduced that experience exactly. Number 4, Alice's Restaurant Massacre by Arlo Guthrie, 1967.
Till I said and create a nuisance, and then they all came back, shook my hand, and we had to...
Arlo Guthrie recorded Alice's Restaurant Massacre for his debut album, released in September 1967. The song runs 18 minutes and 20 seconds, the full side of a vinyl LP, and is a talking blues narrative about a series of events that took place on Thanksgiving Day 1965 in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, culminating in a confrontation at a draft board induction center. The story begins with Guthrie dumping garbage illegally and being arrested and sentenced to pay a $50 fine. It ends with him being rejected for military service by the draft board because his criminal record, the garbage arrest, made him morally unsuitable for the Army. The specific absurdity of the story, being rejected by an institution asking young men to kill people on the grounds that he had dumped garbage, is the point, and it required no explanation to any baby boomer who understood how the draft system worked.
I started jumping up and down, yelling, "Kill! Kill!" And he started jumping up and down.
The draft lottery system that determined which young men went to Vietnam was one of the central facts of baby boomer male life from the mid-1960s through 1973, when the draft ended. The birth date lottery, introduced in December 1969, meant that a young man's military fate was determined by which date was pulled from a bin. The specific relationship between individual citizens and a military-industrial system that was making demands on their bodies and potentially their lives had no equivalent in subsequent American experience. There has been no draft since 1973. Alice's Restaurant communicated the draft's absurdity through comedy rather than protest, which reached people who were exhausted by earnest anti-war songs and who recognized the specific quality of an institution that could be this simultaneously serious and this ridiculous. Guthrie performed it at Woodstock in August 1969. It has been played on American radio every Thanksgiving for over 50 years.
Till I said and create a nuisance, and then they all came back, shook my hand, and we had to...
Number 3, For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield, 1967.
Think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look.
Buffalo Springfield released For What It's Worth in January 1967, and it reached number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100. Stephen Stills wrote it in response to the Sunset Strip curfew riots of November 1966, a series of confrontations on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles between young people gathered outside music clubs and Los Angeles police, enforcing a newly enacted curfew on anyone under 18 being outside after 10 p.m. The The curfew had been imposed partly in response to business complaints about the crowds of young people gathering outside the clubs that had made the Sunset Strip a center of mid-1960s rock culture. The confrontations that followed, police using nightsticks on young people who were, in many cases, simply standing outside a music venue, were local news that became national. The specific image Stills wrote about, police lines, paranoia, the sense that something was happening that could not quite be named, was drawn from his own observation of the events on the Strip.
Think it's time we stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody.
For baby boomers, the song communicated something beyond its specific subject matter. The sense of menace, the feeling of institutional authority confronting young people in a public space, the specific quality of a generation watching itself being defined as a problem to be managed. These were experiences that were playing out simultaneously in multiple American cities in the mid-1960s. The song was covered and used in connection with Vietnam War protests, campus demonstrations, and various civil rights events because its emotional content translated across contexts. It described a relationship between young people and established authority that baby boomers were living as a permanent condition of their adolescence.
Think it's time we stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look.
Number 2, Eve of Destruction by Barry McGuire, 1965.
We're on the eve of destruction.
Barry McGuire had been a member of the New Christie Minstrels before going solo, and Eve of Destruction was his commercial breakthrough. It was written by P.F. Sloan and recorded in a single session in July 1965, released that August and reaching number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 within weeks. The song is a direct and uncompromising statement of apocalyptic anxiety. The world, as of 1965, is on the verge of destroying itself, and the singer wants to know what the listener is thinking. The specific references are precise to 1965. The Selma to Montgomery marches, the escalation in Vietnam, the bomb, the specific combination of racial violence and military escalation that was the reality of that year.
Tell me over and over and over.
Radio stations banned it. A BC declined to play it. Counterpart stations programmed a direct answer song, Dawn of Correction by the Spokesman, to rebut its pessimism. The moral panic around Eve of Destruction was itself a demonstration of the specific anxiety it was describing. A song that stated plainly that the situation was dangerous was treated as dangerous rather than as accurate. For baby boomers who were teenagers in 1965, the song was one of the first times the popular music they consumed directly addressed the political reality they were inheriting. The draft, the bomb, the civil rights struggle, the sense of living in a world that their parents' generation had created and that they had not been consulted about. All of it was there at number 1 on AM radio in August 1965. Young people today can understand political anxiety. They cannot fully understand what it felt like to be 18 in 1965, hearing this at number 1 on the radio, knowing their draft number was waiting.
We're on the eve of destruction.
Number 1, The Times They Are A-Changin by Bob Dylan, 1964.
The times they are a-changin'.
Bob Dylan released The Times They Are A-Changin' as the title track of his third album in January 1964. He has said in interviews that he wrote it as a deliberate anthem, that he had taken the folk tradition of songs that marked social turning points and attempted to write one consciously. The result is one of the most precise statements of generational conflict in the history of American popular music. The song addresses parents directly, politicians directly, senators and congressmen directly, telling them that the world they have built and controlled is changing in ways they cannot stop, and that the children they are raising will not accept the world as given. The specific quality of the second verse, addressed to parents, telling them not to criticize what they cannot understand, that their sons and daughters are beyond their command, communicated something to baby boomer teenagers that no previous generation of American popular music had stated so directly.
The times they are a-changin'.
The song was released 7 weeks after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, an event whose specific impact on baby boomers has been described in nearly every account of the generation's psychological formation. Kennedy had represented the possibility of a new political generation, younger than the World War II generation, in control of the country's direction. His murder removed that possibility and simultaneously confirmed the song's thesis about how unstable the apparent order of things actually was. Dylan performed The Times They Are A-Changin' at the 1964 Civil Rights Benefit in New York, at multiple folk festivals, and it became one of the most performed songs of the decade. The specific relationship between the song's statement that a generational change is coming and cannot be stopped, and the actual events of the following decade gave it a quality of prophecy that only made sense as the decade unfolded. A baby boomer who heard it in 1964 heard a promise. A baby boomer who heard it in 1970 heard something more complicated, the confirmation that the change had arrived, and the recognition of what the change had cost.
The times they are a-changin'.
If any of these sent you somewhere specific, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more playlists like this one waiting.